The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradiobreathing.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I'll be reading from Sunday, May 17th issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is an editorial. Trump's China policy has weakened America. U.S.-China summits can change the world. President Richard Nixon's 1972 trip to Beijing gave the United States an advantage over the Soviet Union in the Cold War. President Jiang Zemin's 1997 tour of the United States eased China's entry into the global economy and accelerated its national rise. Last week's summit in Beijing between President Trump and President Xi Jinping ended with few concrete accomplishments, but Americans should be relieved about that. The most likely alternative was a setback for the United States. When Mr. Trump first won the presidency a decade ago, he correctly labeled China a threat to American interest and criticized past U.S. presidents for their naivete. In both his terms in office, however, he has weakened the United States relative to China. The damage is especially bad in his second term. His failed tariffs have been the central example, setting off a humbling chain of events. The tariffs proved ineffective in intimidating China, even before the Supreme Court ruled some of them illegal. In response, China restricted U.S. access to valuable rare earth minerals and learned just how much leverage it has. To regain access to the minerals, Mr. Trump agreed to allow China to buy advanced American semiconductors that power artificial intelligence. He has also diluted instruments of American power that have long been critical to constraining foreign adversaries. He has alienated partners that can help counter China, including Japan, Australia, India, the European Union, and Canada. He has cut funding for scientific research, diminishing American powers in AI, green energy, and other realms. Mr. Trump arrived in Beijing without the aura of strength that he cherishes. His war in Iran has hurt the American economy, and he focused on lobbying Mr. Xi to buy more American goods in agriculture and other sectors. In exchange, Mr. Xi wanted weaker American support for Taiwan and even more access to American semiconductors. Either of these exchanges would have been a bad deal for the United States. The leader instead spoke vaguely about having reset the two countries' relations. We have established a new bilateral relationship based on constructive strategic stability, Mr. Xi said. The stability would be welcome in several areas. The countries should ensure that bilateral military communications continue to avoid a misunderstanding that sparks war. They should also work together on shared interests, such as limits on AI, to prevent the development of low weapons. But Mr. Trump should avoid getting into Mr. Xi on other areas in coming months. China has its own problems, starting with wary Asian neighbors, a real estate downturn, a disappointing job market, and a demographic collapse. Those vulnerabilities offer the United States a chance to undo some of Mr. Trump's damage and start rebuilding for the long competition ahead. China policy is rare area in which Mr. Trump shifted the consensus in both the GOP and the Democratic Party. In his 2016 campaign, he argued that China had exploited the U.S. and that American leaders need to get together. After taking office, he imposed targeted tariffs on semiconductors, steel, electronics, industrial machinery, and other products. The Biden administration has largely maintained or expanded those tariffs, and it strengthened allies in Asia to restrain China's aggression. For a time, Mr. Trump seemed to have started a bipartisan era of realpolitik toward a country that seeks to diminish American power. As is so often the case, though, Mr. Trump showed little strategic discipline, and he prioritized his personal and political interest over the nation's. Before his first term had ended, he had begun to abandon his apparent concern over China. In his second term, it has become even more accommodating. His administration's national security strategy no longer used the phrase great power competition to describe the relations with China, as Ryan Haas of the Brookings Institution noted. Mr. Trump seems tempted to allow China to dominate Asia, while the U.S. focused on Latin America and the Middle East. It was as if the president decided that the United States was now content to run aside China rather than slow it down or run faster. Evan Medeiros wrote for the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. The second-term terrorists typified the failures. They applied to virtually the entire world, including American allies, and Mr. Trump imposed them haphazardly and illegally. The United States is losing grounds in Asia, the Lowry Institute, an Australian think tank, recently noted. In the past few months, the war in Iran has continued the trend. Some countries skeptical of China, like Vietnam and the Philippines, have nonetheless turned to Beijing for help in getting access to energy. And America's inability to defeat Iran's much smaller military raised questions about whether it could help defend Taiwan from a mainland invasion. The biggest risk of the summit was that Mr. Trump would trade short-term American gains, such as the exporting of more soybeans and other agriculture, for long-term Chinese advantage. Mr. Xi, as part of his effort to reunite Taiwan and mainland China, wants the U.S. to explicitly oppose Taiwanese independence or delay weapon sales to the island. If Mr. Trump yields on either end after the summit, it would be a mistake. Already, Mr. Trump has signed a worrisome lack of interest in Taiwan's future as a democratic ally and economic partner. He has also had an unbecoming desire to please Mr. Xi at times. Semiconductors are a related area of concern. Taiwan manufactures many of the semiconductors that American companies use. China, for its most part, significantly behind the U.S. in the race to develop the most advanced AI. The Biden administration deserves some credit for the gap between it refused to allow American companies to sell the most advanced line of semiconductors to China. Mr. Trump has been weaker on the issue. Mr. Xi very much wants the restrictions removed, and Mr. Trump has begun to loosen them. China now has permission to purchase NVIDIA's high-end H200 chips, but it is still blocked from buying the company's top-line chips, known as Blackwell. If Mr. Trump ever hits that restriction, he will hand Mr. Xi a huge victory. The competition between the U.S. and China matters to the entire world. China wants to dominate Asia and expand its global influence. It wants to discredit democracy and downgrade the importance of human rights and political equality. It wants a world where ethnic and religious oppression is accepted. China is the most important ally of several brutal dictatorships, including Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Everybody who believes in pluralism, freedom, and other liberal values should be rooting against a world where Mr. Xi and the Chinese Communist Party have more sway. The best hope for the United States to win the competition is to reject Mr. Trump's shambolic, self-serving approach to governing and diplomacy. In the long term, the U.S. should employ a version of the strategy that prevailed in the long 20th century struggle against fascism and communism. It involves alliances to rebuild international systems of trade and security for today's world. Doing that will take time. In Beijing last week, Mr. Trump at least seemed to avoid making the task harder by handing Chinese more victories. Next article is written by Ross Douthat. China's peak is now. A grand summit in Beijing is a natural time to assess the state of the U.S.-China competition, the dynamics of a great power conflict, the balance of forces in this cold or maybe just cool war. It's also a good time to revisit my own prediction. 6 years ago, in the early days of the coronavirus, I argued that rather than a Chinese century, we might be looking at a Chinese decade, a window when Chinese power would hit a peak and the American position would be maximally endangered, but with a more favorable balance awaiting the United States in the latter part of the century, if we could get through the Chinese maximum unscathed. One part of the analysis was simply wrong. I was writing in a moment when the American response to the pandemic seemed much more shambolic than Beijing's effective containment strategy. And I assumed that there could be a kind of COVID dividend for China from that difference. In hindsight, America's stumbling approach actually proved more effective than China in the long run because the People's Republic eventually found itself in a permanent lockdown trap that yielded all kinds of social and economic damage. But in other ways, the 20th century have proceeded somewhat as I expected. The American imperium has been hard-pressed on every front, and our leadership, slumping and sentient in the last presidency, obnoxious and bullying in this one, has gifted China a reputation for relative stability, notwithstanding Xi Jinping's own aggressive and repressive moves. There's a lot of talk about rebuilding American manufacturing, and the Trump era has seen a partial decoupling of the United States and China, a clear shift away from the Chimerica model that defined the 2010s. But the decoupling is taking place in the shadow of a profound Chinese industrial advantage and continuing Chinese scientific and technological success. We can't debate what it means that China has lagged behind Silicon Valley in the artificial intelligence race. That's the topic of last week's episode. But our edge in frontier models doesn't feel that definite hard power advantage as long as China is radically outdoing us in building machines and tools and robots and chips and drones. 6 months ago, I was telling myself an optimistic story about the national security balance, where the U.S. maintained an edge in battlefield experience with our support for Ukraine against Russia and our interventions in Iran and Venezuela, serving as a testing ground for new weapons and AI encounter. But watching the American military stockpile collapse under the pressure of a regional war against Iran would make everyone skeptical our advantage adequate for a sustained conflict in East Asia. Fighting Iran in a stalemate seems like the kind of thing would happen just before you fought the Chinese and lose. So the world of 2020 does not seem to have gone China's way in very important respects. To the extent that comparisons to U.S. Cold War are relevant, China is a more powerful material competition than the Soviet ever managed to become. And our so far unsuccessful Iranian gamble has left the American hard power position looked as perilous as it's ever been. But what about the world of the 2040s or 2060s? 6 years ago, I wrote that China's growth rate might be slowing, making it less likely to achieve either the living standards of its eastern neighbors or eclipse the United States as the world's largest economy. Since then, the Chinese attempt to lock in a broad economic sphere and influence through its Belt and Road Initiative has repeated setbacks. Excuse me. The next article is written by Nicholas Kristof. The silence that meets the rape of Palestinians. It's a simple opposition. Whatever our views of the Middle East conflict, we should be able to unite in condemning rape. Supporters of Israel made that point after the brutal sexual assault against Israel women during the Hamas-led attack on Israel October 7, 2023. Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Benjamin Netanyahu, and many U.S. senators, including Marco Rubio, condemned that sexual violence, and Netanyahu rightly called on all civilized leaders to speak up. And yet, in wrenching interviews, Palestinians have recounted to me a pattern of widespread Israeli sexual violence against men, women, and even children by soldiers and settlers and interrogators in the Shin Bet Internal Security Agency, and above all, prison guards. There's no evidence that Israel leaders order rapes, but in recent years they have built a security apparatus where sexual violence has become, as the United Nations report last year, one of Israel's standard operating procedures and a major element in ill treatment of Palestinians. A report last month from the Euromed Human Rights, a Geneva-based advocacy group, often called critical of Israel, concludes that Israel employs systematic sexual violence that is widely practiced as part of an organized state policy. What does a standard operating procedure look like? Samai El-Sal, 46, a freelance journalist, said he was being taken to a prison cell after detention in 2024. A group of guards threw him to the ground. They were all hitting on me, and one stepped on my head and neck, he said. Someone pulled my pants down. They pulled down my boxers. And then one of the guards pulled out a rubber baton used to beat prisoners. They were trying to force it into my rectum, and I was bracing myself to prevent it, but I couldn't, he said, speaking with increasingly anxiety. It was so painful the guards were laughing at him, he said. Then I heard one say, "Give me the carrots." He recalling that they used a carrot. It was extremely painful, I said. I was praying for death. El-Sai was blindfolded, he said, and heard someone say in Hebrew, which he understands, "Don't take photos." That suggested to him that someone had pulled out a camera. One of the guards was a woman who he said grabbed him by the penis and testicles and joked, "These are mine," and then squeezed until he screamed from pain. The guards left him handcuffed on the ground, and he smelled cigarette smoke. I realized it was their smoking break, he said. After he was dumped into a cell, he concluded the spot where he had been raped had been used before, for he found other people's vomit, blood, broken teeth crushed into his skin. Al-Saeed said that he had been asked to become an informant for Israel intelligence, and he believed that the purpose of his arrest and imprisonment under the administrative detention system was to pressure him to agree. Because he prided himself on his journalistic professionalism, he said he refused. An editorial comment, what I just read, obviously is shameful. It's hard to believe that humans treat humans the same way. I've had a career covering war and genocide and atrocities, including rape, sometimes in places where the scale of sexual violence is far greater than anything committed by either Hamas militants or Israel guards or settlers. In the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia a few years ago, 100,000 women may have been raped. Mass rape is now unfolding in Sudan. Yet our American tax dollars subsidize the Israel security establishment. So this is sexual violence in which the United States is complicit. I became interested in reporting on sexual assaults against Palestinian prisoners after Issa Amro, a nonviolent activist, sometimes called the Palestinian Gandhi, told me when I previously visited that he had been sexually assaulted by Israeli soldiers and that he believed this was common, but underreported because of shame. By one count, Israel has detained 20,000 people in the West Bank alone since the October 7th attacks. And more than 9,000 Palestinians were still being held this month. Many have not been charged but were detained on ill-defined security grounds. And since 2023, most have been denied visits from the Red Cross and attorneys. Israel forced to systematically employ rape and sexual torture to humiliate Palestinian female detainees. The Euromed reports that it cited a 42-year-old woman who said she had been shackled and naked to a metal table as Israel soldiers forcibly had sex with her over 2 days while other soldiers filmed the attacks. Afterwards, she said she was shown photos of her being raped and told they would be published if she did not cooperate with Israeli intelligence. It's impossible to know how common sexual assaults against Palestinians are. My reporting for this article is based on conversation with 14 men and women who said they had been sexually assaulted by Israel settlers or members of the security force. I also spoke to family members, investigators, officials, and others. I found these victims by asking around among attorneys, human rights groups, and workers of ordinary Palestinians themselves. In many cases, it was possible to corroborate the victim stories in part by talking to witnesses, or more commonly to those family members, lawyers, and social workers. In other cases, because it was not possible, because shame left people reluctant to acknowledge abuse, even to loved ones. Save the Children commissioned a survey last year of children ages 12 to 17 who have been in Israel detention more than reported witnessing or experiencing sexual violence. Save the Children said that the true figure was probably higher because stigma left some unwilling to acknowledge what had happened to them. The Committee to Protect Journalists, a respected American organization, surveyed 59 Palestinian journalists who had been released by Israel authorities. 3% they had been raped, 92% that they endured other forms of sexual violence. The Israeli government rejects suggestions that it sexually abuses Palestinians, just as Hamas denied raping Israeli women. Israel welcomed the United Nations report documenting sexual assaults against Israel women by Palestinians, but rejected the report's call to investigate Israel assaults against Palestinians. Netanyahu had denounced baseless accusations of sexual violence made against Israel. Israel's Military of National Security declined to comment for this article. The prison service category rejects the allegations of sexual abuse, and a spokesman who declined to be named adding that complaints are examined by the competent authorities. The spokesperson declined to say whether any prison staff had ever been fired or prosecuted for sexual assaults. Palestinians I interviewed recounted various kinds of abuse beyond rape. Many report that often had their genitals yanked and were beaten on the testicles. Handheld metal detectors were used to probe between men's naked legs and then smashed into their private parts. Some men had to have their testicles amputated by doctors after beatings, according to the Euromed mentor. One reason these abuses don't receive more attention is threats by Israeli authorities, who periodically warn prisoners to release to keep quiet. According to Palestinians who have been freed, another reason Palestinian survivors told me is that Arab society discouraged discussing the topic for fear of hurting the morale of prisoners' families and undermining the Palestinian narrative of defiant and heroic detainees. Conservative social norms also inhibit discussion. Two victims told me that a prisoner who acknowledged being raped would harm the ability of his sisters and daughters to find husbands. One farmer initially agreed to let me use his name in this article. Released earlier this year after months in administrative detention with no charges filed, he related what had happened one day last year. Half dozen guards immobilized by holding his arms and legs while pulling down his pants and underwear and inserting a metal baton in his anus. The rapist laughed and cheering, he said. Several hours later, he and was taken to the prisoner clinic. As he woke up, he said he was raped once again with the metal baton. I was bleeding, recall. I broke down completely. I was crying. After being returned to his cell, he said he asked the guard for a pen to write a complaint about the assaults. The request was denied, and that evening a group of guards came into the cell. "Who is the one who wants to file a complaint?" one guard cheered, and another guard pointed him out. His beating started immediately, he recalled, and then they raped him with a baton for a third time that day, he said. He recalled once saying, "Now you have even more to put in your complaint." A few days after I interviewed him, the farmer called to say that he didn't want his name used after all. He had just been visited by Shin Ben and warned not to cause trouble, and he also feared that his family would react badly to the attention. Rampant sexual abuse of Palestinian prisoners is a thing. It's been normalized, said Sari Bashi, an Israeli-American human rights attorney who is the executive director of the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. I don't see evidence that it's been ordered, but there's persistent evidence that the authorities know it's happening and are not stopping it. Another editorial comment. With our mindset in America and democracy and freedom of religion, it just exacerbates. You could be angry at the Palestinians, but torturing them is that any is that a revenge factor that helps you? Tough to understand by good people. Another Israeli attorney, Ben Marabarli, told me that based on the experience of the Palestinian detainees he was represented, rape of Palestinian prisoners with object is going on across the board. Bashi said her organization has filed hundreds of complaints in detailing horrific abuse against Palestinian detainees. And not in a single case did these lead to charges. Filed impunity, she creates a great light for abusers. One Palestinian prisoner from Gaza reportedly was hospitalized in July 2024 with a tear in his rectum, cracked ribs, and punctured lung. Investigators obtained a prison video purportedly showing the abuse. The authorities detained 9 reservist soldiers, but Israel's right-wingers erupted in outrage with a mob of furious protesters, including politicians, breaking into the prison to show support for the guards. The last charge against the soldier was dropped in March. Last month, the military approved the soldiers' return to duty. Netanyahu hailed the dropping of charges at the end of a blood libel. The state of Israel must hunt down the enemies, not its heroic fighters, he said. Bashi described the outcome this way: I would say that dropping the charges, that's giving permission to rape. That prisoners who after reportedly required a stomach bag to collect waste was returned to Gaza, as an acquaintance of his said, he spent months in a hospital recovering from his internal injuries. The acquaintance said the former president declined to be interviewed. Prosecution said public attention to curb such violence. 1997 police officer in New York City raped a Haitian immigrant, Abner Lima, with a stick so that required hospitalization and surgery. New Yorkers were outraged. Mayor Giuliani visited Lima in the hospital, and police officers were prosecuted in an unmarked case. That sent a powerful message throughout the police force. Those who assault detainees may be punished, and that's the message that must be sent throughout the Israeli security forces. If the Trump administration insisted on a resumption of Red Cross visits to prisoners, if the U.S. ambassador to visit rape survivors with cameras in tow, if we condition arm transfers as an end to sexual assault, we could send a moral and practical message that sexual violence is unacceptable no matter the identity of the victim. For starters, the ambassador is going to ensure that those Palestinians who dare to speak for the article are not brutalized again for their courage. How does this kind of violence happen? Decades of covering conflict have taught me that a combination of dehumanization and impunity can propel people into a Hobbesian state of nature. I've encountered this drift towards savagery and killing fields from Congo to Sudan to Myanmar, and I think it also roughly explains how American soldiers came to sexually abuse prisoners in Abu Ghraib in Iraq. The blunt reality is that there are no consequences. We humans are capable of immense depravity toward those we are taught to scorn as subhuman. Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's national security minister, called detainees scum and Nazis, and boasted of making prison conditions harsher for Palestinians. When such attitudes prevail, sexual abuse can become one more tool to inflict pain and humiliation on the Palestinians. Ben-Gvir declined, through his spokesman, to comment on sexual assaults by security forces. B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, documented grave patterns of sexual violence toward Palestinians. It cited the account of a Gaza prisoner, Tamar Karmout, who said he had been raped with a stick, tortured. B'Tselem said it has become an accepted norm. A former Israeli officer in a prison information described in testimony to the Israel group breaking the silence that kind of acceptance means in practice. You see normal, pretty ordinary people reaching a point where they abuse people for their own amusement, not even for interrogation or anything, for fun, to have something to tell the guys, or revenge. Most of the rape and other sexual behavior has been directed at men. if only because Palestinian prisoners are more than 90% male. But I spoke to one Palestinian woman who was arrested at the age of 23 after the Hamas attack on October 23. She said that the soldiers who arrested her threatened to rape her, her mom, and her young niece. Her prison ordeal began with a strip search conducted by female guards. But then a male soldier came in when I was completely naked, she added. For the next few days, she said she was repeatedly stripped naked, beaten, and searched by teams of male and female guards alike. The patterns were always the same. Several guards, men and women together, would come into her cell, forcibly strip her naked, handcuff her hands behind her, and bend her forward at the waist, sometimes forcing her head into the toilet. In that position, she'd be beaten and groped all over, she said. They had their hands all over my body. To be honest, I don't know if they raped me, she said, because she sometimes lost consciousness from the beatings. The aim of the abuse was twofold, she thinks, to crush her spirit and also to let Israel men molest a naked Palestinian woman with impunity. I'd be stripped and beaten several times a day. It was as if they were introducing me to everyone who worked there. At the beginning of each shift, they would bring the guys to strip me. When she was about to be released from prison, she said she was called into a room with 6 officials and given a stern warning never to give interviews. They threatened that if I spoke up, they would rape me, kill my father, she said. Not surprisingly, she declined to be named in this article. Some of the worst sexual abuse appears to have been directed at prisoners from Gaza. A Gaza journalist shared with me his account of the abuse he suffered after he stayed in 2024. No one escaped sexual assault, she said. Not all were raped, I would say, but everybody went through humiliating, filthy sexual assaults. One occasion, he said the guards zip-tied his testicle and penis for hours while beating his genitals. For days after, he said he urinated blood. On one occasion, he said he was still held down and stripped naked, and as he was blindfolded and handcuffed, the dog was summoned. With encouragement from handler, he said the dog mounted him. They were using cameras to take pictures, and I heard their laughs and giggles. He tried to dislodge the dog, he said, but it penetrated him. Editorial comment: sick, sick, sick people. Other Palestinian prisoners, also human rights monitors, have also cited a report of police dogs being coached to rape prisoners. The journalist said that when he was released, an Israel official warned him, if you want to stay alive when you return, do not speak to the media. So why was he willing to speak? There are moments when remembering feels unbearable. My heart felt it might stop while talking to you about it just now. But I remember there are people still in there, so I speak up. Multiple accounts indicate that sexual violence has been directed even at Palestinian children who are typically imprisoned for throwing stones. I located and interviewed 3 boys who have been detained and all described being sexually abused. One, a shy boy in a Hilfiger shirt who was 15 years old at the time, declined to say whether he had also witnessed rape, but he said threats were routine. They'd say, do this or we'll put this stick up your butt. The other boys told similar stories of sexual violence as part of beatings and know that the threats of rape were directed not only at them, but also at their mothers and siblings. Israeli settlers are not an official arm of the state in the same way that the prison system is, but the Israeli Defense Force increasingly protects settlers as they attack Palestinian villagers and use sexual violence to drive Palestinians to flee. Sexualized violence is used in pressure communities to leave their land, according to a report by the West Bank Consortium, a coalition of international groups led by the Norwegian Refugee Council. The consortium surveyed Palestinian farmers have found that more than 70% of households that have been displaced reported that threats to women and children, particularly of sexual violence, were the decisive reason for leaving. Sexual violence, said Allegro Pacheco of the coalition, is one of the mechanics driving people from the line. In a remote Jordan Valley hamlet of Bedouin farmers, I met a 20-year-old farmer, Shuhab Abulakabash, who recounted how a gang of about 20 settlers rampaged through the homes of his family, beating adults and children alike and stealing jewelry and 400 sheep. Also cut off his clothes with a hunting knife and then tightly zip-tied his penis and yanked. I was afraid they would cut off my penis. I thought this was the end for me. Some may wonder whether Palestinians fabricated accusation of sexual assault to defame Israel. To me, that seems far-fetched, because none of those I interviewed sought me out or knew who else I was speaking to, and they were reluctant to speak. Yet there is some evidence that Israel's sexual abuse has become so frequent that norms are changing and Palestinian victims are becoming a bit more willing to speak out. For 6 months I couldn't speak out, even to my family, said Mohammed Matar, a Palestinian official who told me that settlers stripped him, beat him, and poked him with a stick in the buttocks while talking about raping him. During the attack, the assailants posted a photograph on social media of him blindfolded and stripped to his underpants. With time, Matar decided to speak out to try to break the stigma. He now keeps a blown-up print of the settlers' photos of him on the walls of the office. To try to make sense of what I found, I called up Ehud Olmert, who was Israel's prime minister from 2000 to 2009. Olmert told me he didn't know much about sexual violence but was not surprised by the accounts I had heard. Do I believe it happens? He asked. Definitely. There are war crimes committed every day in the territories, he added. So, return to the point I noted at the beginning of this column. Supporters of Israel were right in 2023 that whatever our views against the Middle East, we should be able to repudiate rape. Where the hell are you? Netanyahu asked the international community, then demanding that it condemn sexual violence committed by what the Israeli men call the Hamas rapist regime. Hamas has indeed virtually violated human rights. Israel officials look to their own violations as well. In particular, at a 49-page United Nations report last year called Israel Systematically Subjecting Palestinians to Sexual Torture, committed with at least an implicit encouragement by the way top civilian and military leadership. Think of it this way: the horrific abuse inflicted on Israel women on October 7th now happens to Palestinians day after day. It persists because of the silence, indifference, and failure of Americans and Israeli officials alike to answer Netanyahu's query, where the hell are you? Editorial comment. I have to believe that Christoph's reporting is true, and it's so sad. It's too to comprehend. You understand if somebody does something wrong to incarcerate them, but to do what's being done. And Christoph is right. The silence that meets the rape of Palestinians. This article is written by Jamel Bowie. The court has left us in a dangerous place. The immediate consequence of the Supreme Court decision in Louisiana versus Calais is that Republican-led states in the South can destroy their majority-minority districts and in turn deprive the black residents of federal representation by politicians of their choosing. Within days of the ruling, in fact, lawmakers in Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama rushed to do just that, practically gloating over the opportunity to purge Democrats, most of them black, from their congressional delegations. For too long, Tennessee politics has been dominated by cosmopolitan communists and race hustlers imposing their corrupt will on a deeply rural and conservative state. Representative Oogles of Tennessee wrote on X this month. The General Assembly's Constitution withdrawing a federal district's firm foundation truth. Tennessee must be represented by Tennesseans, not socialist Democrats. In a similar vein, Shad White, the Mississippi State Auditor, posted on X, "We're fighting so that Benny Thompson, who represents the state's 2nd District, and Hakeem Jeffries, who are not in charge. We're fighting for a country that is safe, where our taxes don't go up, where our border is secure." To watch this whole spectacle is to put the lie to the idea, seen in the court's opinion as well as among the court's apologists, that the South has changed so much since 1965 that a strong Voting Rights Act is no longer necessary. As Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg observed in her dissent in the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder, in which Chief Justice John Roberts took his first swing at the law, to look at the fruits of federal protection and conclude the protection is outmoded amounts of throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. But this again is the immediate consequence of the court's ignominious decision. The main consequence, however, might be to undermine American democracy altogether and push this nation's politics to an even more dangerous place of high partisan tension and ideological balkanization. In Calais, Justice Samuel Alito framed partisan gerrymandering as a legitimate state interest, that state lawmakers had the right to shape their political community as they saw fit. As stated rights may target partisan distribution voters a separate margin of victory for certain incumbent or other goal not prohibited by the Constitution. In his view, as well as that of the rest of the Republican majority in the court, there is no underlying principle of democracy or fair play in the Constitution that would compel the state legislature not to embrace the most egregiously partisan gerrymandering imaginable. As we've seen in the South Post-Calais, Republicans have done that very thing under the theory that representation is a gift the political majority bestows on the minority, not a fundamental right of democracy. On top of that, they seem to threat partisan identity as an immutable quality of the state separate from the voters. It is not to look back to Oakley's comments that Tennessee voters are represented in the House, and many of them happen to be Republican. But the Tennessee is Republican. The delegation must match this supposed general will of the state, even if a large part of the voting public back the other side. Democrats may not believe the same of the states that lead, but they have followed suit regardless. To do otherwise would be to put themselves at the mercy of the Republican Party as it uses extreme partisan gerrymandering to give itself a durable structural advantage in the House of Representatives. As my new side colleague Nate Cohen noted, Republicans could eventually give themselves an advantage of roughly 4 percentage points in the House, meaning that Democrats would need to win the national House popular vote by at least 4 points to win a bare majority in the chamber. The effect of this arms race is a house that looks something like the Electoral College. If you can win control of a state capital, no matter how narrow the victor or how slim the majority, then you can immediately redraw congressional and state legislature maps to lock your party in power. Republicans will lose represented in blue states, Democrats in red states. It is true that in theory, a Republican lawmaker could represent a majority Democratic city just fine. In practice, not so much. Rigid partisanship does not usually select for the kind of person who might try to represent the entire community. A system which political parties can rewrite the rules to keep themselves in power indefinitely, a system in which bearing a tsunami opposition they cannot lose. It's not a democracy in any meaningful sense, but that is where the United States is headed, if it's not already there, thanks in part to Roberts and his majority, who have enabled the worst tendencies for their co-partisan in the Republican Party. For his part, Roberts was his work as fundamentally apolitical. We're simply not part of the political process. And there's a reason that, and I'm not sure people grasp that much as appropriate. And Democrats must do everything they can to win power so they can actually build a more equitable political system than trim the authority of the institutions, like the Supreme Court, that stand in the way of greater democracy. Fighting in the system as it exists also means that if they manage to win majorities in the House, and especially the Senate, Democrats must abolish both the filibuster in the Senate and any procedure obstacles to a more majorative Congress. Ultimately, political reform will take the shape of artisan project, a specific party-driven strategy, not a broad partisan compromise. This could be a passage of a stronger, revitalized voting rights, along with a national ban on partisan gerrymandering and mid-decade redistricting. In other words, some combination of the John Lewis Voting Acts and the Stillborn for the People Act, or it could be something more radical, like expanding the size of the House, which has been capped at 453 members for nearly a century, legalizing electoral fusion, or moving the country toward proportional representation. Whatever Democrats do, they must do something. If the aim of our political system is fair and meaningful representation for all Americans, then we are far from the target and receding even further. You could even paraphrase the words of an old socialist saying that the American society stands at a crossroads, either transition to democracy or regression into barbarism. Which will we choose? Huh? Why is healthcare so costly? These are letters to the editor. The biggest cost of high healthcare spending. As a physician, a healthcare consumer, and the former chief executive of a small rural hospital, I read Dr. Cooper's essay with great interest. While I think he's correct in how hospital charges contribute to healthcare, I wonder about what else caused this. My hospital charged high prices for commercially insured patients so it could survive. We lost money on so many other patients that high prices for hip procedures for Blue Cross and others who were injured was the only way to keep the doors open to provide other care. That other care, on which we lost lots of money, included providing emergency primary care for 20,000 rural Mainers. It also included providing basic care to Medicare patients with pneumonia, congestive heart failure, and other ailments. Some experts' insight to the hospitals judged that demand should have been helpful. To the editor, Zach Cooper's article was a timely and important contribution to the dialogue about rising costs. However, one aspect of hospital charges that he did not mention: rarely does anyone pay the posted rates. Insurers negotiate their own rate schedule, as evidenced by example of variability in the cost of hip replacement. Self-pay and charity care are handled differently, billed partly to patients, with the rest usually written off. If insurers are not working to generate returns for shareholders, their primary stated mission, a majority of hospitals would not need to post list prices as high. The demands for profit healthcare with prioritized shareholders over patients is a problem. Treating healthcare as a right and a social good, not as an engine for shareholder value, would lower the cost most effectively. Written by Julia Rogers, is a former faculty member at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, May 17th, issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from the New York Times opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader's been Dick Shanley. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which